I come to you with a broken heart. You may have heard by now that my wife Suzanne, whom I love very much and always will, filed for divorce. The children and I never expected this to happen.
A shocking announcement has brought Pastor Benny Hinn's painful divorce back into the spotlight. Behind the famous preacher's global ministry was a marriage that endured personal struggles, separation, reconciliation, and ultimately another divorce. Now, his ex-wife Suzanne Hinn has revealed something that adds a surprising new layer to their story. What really happened between the couple, and why did their marriage fall apart twice? The truth behind their relationship is far more complicated than it first appeared. The divorce that was really a cry for help. Behind the public image of Benny Hinn's successful ministry, Suzanne Hinn was quietly dealing with a personal battle that would eventually place their marriage under tremendous pressure. In 1997, she left for what was intended to be a 3-week medical evaluation, hoping to understand what she was going through and finally find some relief. Instead, the treatment became the beginning of a struggle that would continue for years. Suzanne later explained that she had been misdiagnosed and prescribed several medications. Rather than resolving the difficulties she was experiencing, she said she gradually became dependent on them. The medications began affecting both her emotional and physical well-being, and there were moments when her behavior felt completely unlike the person she believed herself to be. There was another problem that made the situation even harder. Benny did not fully realize how much medication Suzanne was taking or how deeply it was affecting her. As her personal struggles continued, the distance between them grew, and Suzanne eventually reached a point where she felt unable to cope with everything happening around her. Then came a decision that would change the course of their marriage. Suzanne filed for divorce. From the outside, the decision could have looked like a straightforward attempt to end a troubled relationship. But Suzanne later offered a much more complicated explanation. After signing the divorce papers, she went to a friend's house because she needed someone to comfort her. She hugged her friend, and moments later she suddenly fainted. Looking back, Suzanne said the divorce was not simply about wanting to leave Benny. She described it as a desperate attempt to get his attention and a cry for help when she felt overwhelmed by everything she was experiencing. That detail adds a completely different dimension to the story. What appeared to be the collapse of a marriage was also connected to Suzanne's struggle with her own emotional and physical condition. Yet, the decision still had enormous consequences. Benny was now facing the loss of his wife, while their family was forced to navigate a painful separation. And the next chapter would be just as difficult. As the couple spent years apart, Benny would begin confronting his own failures and priorities, while Suzanne faced another challenge that would determine whether she could truly move forward. The divorce had broken them apart, but the road to healing was only beginning. Benny Hinn was forced to face the truth. The separation did more than leave an empty space in Benny Hinn's personal life. It forced him to confront painful questions about the way he had balanced his ministry, his responsibilities, and his family. Benny later described the 2.5 years apart from Suzanne as some of the most agonizing of his life. During that period, he began looking at his marriage from a different perspective. Benny came to believe that he had not given his wife and family the attention they deserved. The demands of ministry had consumed so much of his time and energy that he eventually recognized how easily his responsibilities as a preacher could overshadow his responsibilities as a husband and father. For Benny, that realization became a deeply humbling experience. He came to believe that the separation had forced him to see problems he might otherwise have continued overlooking. Rather than placing all the blame on Suzanne, he publicly acknowledged his own shortcomings and asked his family for forgiveness. He also asked the wider Christian community to forgive him. But while Benny was reflecting on his mistakes, Suzanne was facing a battle of her own. The medications that had become part of her life were still an obstacle. The divorce had not erased the struggles that had contributed to it, and Suzanne understood that reconciliation would mean little if she could not first address what was happening within herself. In early 2010, Suzanne entered the Betty Ford Center for Intensive Treatment, beginning a difficult but important stage in her journey toward recovery. She remained at the facility for 3.5 months, receiving professional support as she worked through the dependency that had developed over the years. The experience was not easy, but Suzanne later explained that treatment helped her gain a clearer understanding of what she had been experiencing. She also came to recognize how the medications had affected her emotions, behavior, and overall well-being. For Suzanne, confronting those struggles became an important step toward rebuilding her life. Treatment also taught her how to recognize situations that could overwhelm her and how to respond without depending on substances. Eventually, she was able to say that she had broken free from the medications. That was a major turning point. Suzanne was beginning to heal, while Benny was being forced to reconsider the choices that had affected his family. Meanwhile, their loved ones continued hoping that the separation would not become permanent. Suzanne later said the family continued praying and fervently interceding for the restoration of the marriage. But healing did not automatically erase everything that had happened. The couple still had to confront years of hurt, distance, and difficult memories. And somehow, despite everything that had driven them apart, Benny and Suzanne would eventually find their way back to one another. What happened next seemed almost impossible, considering where their marriage had been just a few years earlier. They would not simply reconcile privately. They would make a decision that shocked many people watching their story from the outside. They were going to get married again, but their second chance at love would eventually face a new set of challenges, and this time, the ending would be even more unexpected. After divorce, they said, "I do," again. Few people would have expected Benny and Suzanne Hinn to stand beside each other at the altar again after everything they had endured. The couple had originally married on August 4, 1979, but after more than 3 decades together, their relationship reached a breaking point. Suzanne filed for divorce in February 2010, bringing an extraordinary chapter of their marriage to an end. Yet, the story did not stay there. 3 years later, the couple stunned many people by choosing to reconcile and marry again. Their remarriage took place before a large audience at the Holy Land Experience in Orlando, Florida, with the late Pastor Jack Hayford officiating the ceremony. What had once looked like a permanent separation was suddenly being presented as a story of restoration. The significance of the moment was difficult to miss. Benny and Suzanne had spent years apart, worked through deeply personal struggles, and endured the emotional consequences of their first divorce. Now, they were publicly declaring that their relationship deserved another chance. Benny Hinn Ministries even made recordings of the ceremony available on DVD for $25, further turning the event into a highly visible moment within their ministry world. For a while, it appeared that the Hinns had managed to leave their painful past behind. But their reunion happened during a complicated period in Benny's public life. His ministry was facing increased scrutiny and a number of major challenges. His television program was removed from Trinity Broadcasting Network in 2016, followed by its removal from Daystar Television Network the following year. His ministry had also faced financial questions, including a congressional inquiry initiated by Senator Chuck Grassley in 2007. Then there was another controversy that had already followed Benny after Suzanne's first divorce filing. Benny had been photographed holding hands with fellow televangelist Paula White in Rome. The image generated significant media attention and added another layer of public pressure to an already complicated period in his personal life. Despite the scrutiny, Benny and Suzanne had chosen to rebuild their marriage in 2013. Their reunion seemed to suggest that the couple had overcome the worst of their difficulties, but rebuilding a relationship and keeping it intact are two very different things. Years after their remarriage, Suzanne would once again take a step that nobody could easily ignore. The woman who had once returned to Benny after their first divorce would eventually file for divorce again. And that raises an even bigger question. Who was Suzanne Hinn before her name became permanently connected to Benny Hinn? To understand the woman behind the divorce story, we have to go back long before the marriage, the fame, and the public controversies. Who was Suzanne Hinn before Benny? Before Suzanne Hinn became known around the world as Benny Hinn's wife, she was already deeply connected to the world of Christian ministry. Her childhood was shaped by church life, prayer, Bible teaching, and a family that treated ministry as more than a weekend responsibility. Those early experiences would eventually influence the direction of her own life. Suzanne was born Suzanne Hinn into a family with strong ties to Pentecostal Christianity. Her parents, Roy Hinn and Pauline Lillian Hinn, were involved in pastoral work and Christian teaching, and Suzanne grew up alongside her sisters, Leanne and Elizabeth. Their household was closely connected to the Assemblies of God tradition, meaning church and ministry were part of everyday family life. Her father, Roy, became a respected figure within American Pentecostal ministry. He worked as a pastor, Bible teacher, musician, broadcaster, and Christian leader, while also traveling to teach and encourage churches and ministers. Roy and Pauline reportedly led Calvary Assembly of God in Winter Park, Florida, from 1970 to 1981. That environment gave Suzanne an unusual childhood. Instead of simply watching her parents go to church, she grew up surrounded by ministers, worship services, prayer meetings, and Christian teaching. Ministry was woven into the family's daily life. Suzanne would later develop a public ministry of her own, focusing heavily on prayer, intercession, emotional healing, and spiritual growth. But before any of that, she needed to establish her own educational and spiritual path. She reportedly attended Evangel College in Springfield, Missouri, a Christian institution connected to the Assemblies of God tradition. The school provided an environment where students could prepare for ministry, Christian service, education, and other careers. It was during this chapter of her life that something unexpected happened. According to Benny Hinn's later recollections, Roy Hinn introduced him to the idea of meeting his daughter. Benny was already involved in evangelistic work, while Suzanne was a young college student. Roy reportedly showed Benny a photograph of Suzanne, and Benny later recalled believing that she would eventually become his wife. The two eventually met during the summer of 1978. At that point, neither could have known what that meeting would eventually lead to. Their relationship would grow into marriage, children, ministry success, painful struggles, divorce, reconciliation, and ultimately, another divorce decades later. But their story did not begin with any of those complications. It began with a young woman raised in a ministry family and a young evangelist whose career was beginning to expand. And behind that first meeting was another important piece of the story. Suzanne was not simply being introduced to Benny Hinn. She was entering a relationship that would eventually place her own faith, identity, and ministry under a very public spotlight. So how did that introduction turn into marriage? And what role did Suzanne's own ministry background play in bringing the two together? That is where their story truly begins. The beginning of a 46-year story. A meeting arranged through Suzanne's family would eventually become the starting point of a relationship that lasted for decades. When Roy Hinn invited Benny Hinn to speak in Florida during the summer of 1978, neither man could have known that the visit would lead to one of the most complicated marriages in Benny's life. At the time, Suzanne was attending Evangel College in Springfield, Missouri. She had been raised in a Christian ministry family and was already familiar with the demands that came with serving in the church. Benny, meanwhile, was building his reputation as a young evangelist and spending much of his time traveling for ministry. Roy had already crossed paths with Benny through their shared involvement in Christian ministry, and their connection eventually led to an introduction that would change both families forever. According to Benny's later recollections, Roy told the young evangelist about his daughter Suzanne before the two had properly met. He even showed Benny a photograph of her. Benny later recalled that seeing Suzanne's picture left a strong impression on him, and he believed that she would one day become his wife. The prediction would prove remarkably significant. When the two finally met during the summer of 1978, they already had something important in common. Both came from Pentecostal Christian backgrounds, and both understood that ministry could place unusual demands on a person's life. Suzanne's upbringing had prepared her to understand the world Benny was entering, while Benny was already moving toward a career that would eventually make him internationally recognized. Their relationship developed after that introduction, and roughly a year later, they made their commitment official. On August 4, 1979, Suzanne Hinn and Benny Hinn were married. At the time, there was no way to predict how much their lives would change in the decades ahead. The young couple would eventually raise a family, while Benny's ministry expanded dramatically. Suzanne would also develop her own involvement in Christian ministry, particularly around prayer, intercession, and spiritual restoration. But behind the public success would come struggles that neither of them could have anticipated. Their marriage would eventually endure years of pressure. Suzanne's personal difficulties, a painful separation, and the first divorce. Then, after spending years apart, they would surprise the public by finding their way back to each other and marrying again. That reunion, however, would not become the final chapter. The couple would eventually face another divorce, bringing their extraordinary relationship to a very different conclusion. And after spending so much of her life connected to Benny Hinn, Suzanne would have to continue building an identity and ministry that stood on their own. So what happened to Suzanne after their marriage finally came to an end? And what has she been doing since stepping away from the relationship that made her famous? Her life after Benny tells another side of the story. What happened to Suzanne after the divorce? Life after Benny Hinn has not meant the end of Suzanne Hinn's public ministry. Instead, her work has continued to revolve around the subjects that have shaped much of her spiritual life: prayer, intercession, healing, and spiritual restoration. In January 2025, Suzanne appeared in a program centered on intercession and the healing of the body and soul. She later joined Katie Souza for discussions about the responsibilities and challenges involved in living as an intercessor. Rather than presenting prayer as something reserved for emergencies, Suzanne has continued to describe it as an ongoing commitment that requires discipline, compassion, patience, and determination. That message fits closely with the themes that have appeared throughout her ministry. Suzanne has frequently spoken about emotional healing, forgiveness, spiritual growth, and the importance of developing a deeper relationship with God. Those subjects also carry a very personal significance considering the struggles she has publicly discussed throughout her own life. Her ministry activities have continued through church gatherings, interviews, conferences, and collaborative Christian events. She has also remained associated with Purifying Fire International Ministries and has participated in programs designed to encourage Christians in prayer and spiritual development. But there is an important difference between Suzanne's current public role and the one she once held beside Benny. For years, much of the world's attention was focused on her marriage to one of the most recognizable televangelists in the Christian world. Today, her public work is more closely associated with prayer ministry and personal spiritual restoration. She is no longer simply being introduced as Benny Hinn's wife. That shift becomes even more significant following the couple's second divorce in November 2025. Suzanne has generally kept details of her personal life private, and reliable public reporting has not clearly established where she currently lives or provided extensive information about what happens away from her ministry work. Rather than constantly revisiting the details of her marriage, her recent public appearances have largely focused on faith and the work she continues to do. In many ways, that makes the ending of her marriage feel less like the conclusion of her story and more like the closing of one chapter. Suzanne's journey has included a marriage that lasted decades, a devastating separation, divorce, personal struggles, treatment, reconciliation, remarriage, and eventually another divorce. Through all of those changes, prayer has remained one of the central themes of the life she presents publicly. And that may be the most unexpected part of her story. The woman once known primarily as Benny Hinn's wife has continued building a public identity around her own ministry, experiences, and message. Her relationship with Benny may have shaped a major part of her life, but it does not appear to be the only thing defining her anymore. After everything they experienced together, one question still remains. Was their second divorce truly the end of the story, or simply the moment Suzanne finally began writing a chapter of her own? What do you think about Benny Hinn and Suzanne Hinn's extraordinary journey? Share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more stories you may not have heard before. Suzanne and Benny Hinn's story is one of love, struggle, separation, reconciliation, and an ending few could have predicted. But what do you think really caused their marriage to fall apart? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to watch our next video for another story you won't want to miss.